Hello, everyone. I'm Georgia Kyleman, and I'm going to be moderating this next session, Leaving the Homeland. I would like to introduce our panelists first before we get going. And I'm going to start with Professor Alexander Kitroeff. And he is currently a professor of history at Haverford College in Pennsylvania and has taught in several other institutions, including the Center for Byzantine and Modern Greek Studies at Queens College, CUNY, and the Onassis Center for Hellenic Studies in New York University, and the American College of Greece, and college year in Athens. I don't know what that means, but okay.
College year in Athens is the study abroad, American students who study abroad.
Okay. His most recent books are The Greeks and the Making of Modern Egypt and The Greek Orthodoxy in America, A Modern History, which really pertains to what we're talking about today. Our next panelist is Professor Gonda von Steen. She earned a PhD degree in Classics and Hellenic Studies from Princeton University and holds the position of Correas Chair in the Center of Hellenic Studies and the Department of Classics at King's College London. She has written several books, and her latest book, Adoption, Memory, and Cold War Greece, Quid Pro Quo, is pertinent to our discussions today. Then I'm going to introduce our last panelist, which is Gregory Kontos, who's the star of our Greek Ancestry Conference. I don't think he needs any further introduction. Okay. I'm going to start out with a question for Gregory. So Gregory, when and how did Greek migration to the US start? And where did they settle? And was there Greek migration to other countries in the same time period?
So we are aware of the economic Greek migration to the United States, which started in the 1880s and continued well into the 1920s. And we have Alexander here, who is the best person to talk to us about all that. But there was another migration current that started decades back in the 1840s. That migration was different to the one that followed, but it is interesting, and there are lots of things we can learn through its study. So that migration was centered around trade. We are talking about the time before the American Civil War, when cotton trade was at its highest. A company that belonged to the Rallis brothers from Chios and was based in London was engaged in this trade and opened its first American branch in New York in 1846. The company's branches in the US expanded in the following years. They opened offices in Boston, in St. Louis, and San Francisco, and New Orleans. Prominent Greeks, especially from Chios, were in charge of these branches. At the same time, these people would also take up consular posts representing the Greek state and securing Greek trade interests. So they and their families started settling more or less permanently in the United States. And this is the one group of Greek immigrants in the US in that period. The second group, the majority group, consisted of sailors, Greeks who came on board merchant vessels but decided to disembark and stay, again, more or less permanently in the States. After disembarking, these sailors would take up all sorts of occupations. Many became fishermen, others became artisans, fruit dealers. They opened little shops and cafes. And here's an excerpt from an 1873 newspaper article describing Greek coffee shops in New Orleans. Quote, "The American bar is combined with little oriental tables around which are seated Greeks talking all at the same time generally. All the idioms of the Grecian archipelago, drinking coffee and smoking paper cigarettes." Sounds familiar. So many became sailors again when we're traveling back and forth the Mississippi. In any case, the major port cities of the United States were the base of both groups, merchants and the rest. In the same time period, similar Greek colonies were formed in port cities in Europe, in London, in Liverpool, in Malta, in India, in Australia. Indeed, in 1869, according to an official report, there were about 500 Greeks, mostly men, in Australia, most of whom lived in Melbourne and Sydney. According to the same report, the first Greeks to settle in Australia came around 1800. That's about 30 years earlier than we knew so far. And the majority of these men, both in Australia and in the US, they tended to marry local women. And as there were no Greek schools, their children spoke English after a while. Now, what is really interesting is that stereotypes around Greek immigrants at that time period were generally positive. Americans would see them as something exotic, and most importantly, they would identify them as descendants and heirs of classical Greeks. That perception can be attributed to Romanticism and to its Greek expression, Philhellenism. And this positive impression led many Americans and Europeans to support Greek national causes. For instance, when the revolution of 1866 broke out in Crete, many relief committees were formed and supported the cause by making donations and propagating the rights of the revolutionaries. They took care of orphans and widows. They donated to the fleet. They published leaflets of support. However, positive stereotypes can also be attributed to the small number of Greek immigrants in that period for many reasons, which have to do with mobility, the timing of census taking, and many immigrants' fear of being registered. We are not able to know exactly how many Greeks there were in the US or in Australia. We are talking about a range scale of hundreds. As to how to trace a Greek immigrant of that period, US records are a prerequisite. Census records, city directories, naturalizations, ship manifests, all these are really helpful. However, the old records of the Orthodox churches in America can also be very valuable. For instance, vital records of the Orthodox Church in New Orleans, Holy Trinity, date back to the 1880s, and in one case, even earlier. And recently, Greek Ancestry and EMCA announced a joint project to digitize such church vital records collections for free. And we are open to proposals for that.
Okay. Alexander, why did the Greeks leave the homeland at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century? That's when we had our big migration from Greece. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I can talk about it, Georgia, yes, and I have a couple of slides I'd like to share as well. Sure. I'm going to share my screen and bring the slides up, and these are the questions I wanted to address. And okay. Here's this is the mass migration. So Gregory spoke about the 19th century, which is a varied migration of different peoples, of merchants, of mostly wealthier persons, but also some early Peloponnesians. And this is what I'm talking about, is what we call mass migration, which begins in the 1890s and ends in the 1920s. With over 400,000 persons who are either Greeks, or when we say Greek race, they're of Greek origin, but they're from the Ottoman Empire, so they haven't got Greek papers. 400 of them come over. By 1900, 25,000 had entered. And the peak years are 1907 and 1914 with 46 and 45,000 people. That is a lot of people leaving Greece. And the extraordinary thing is that they leave the port of Patra that you see here in the slide, but there's also other smaller ports in Peloponnesus where by 1912 you could get a boat from there and go over to the United States. I'm talking about Yithio in Laconia and Katakolo in Ilia. If you visit those places now, I mean, they're beautiful, but they basically have big kaikia and maybe some yachts. The idea that you could get a ship from Yithio to come to the US is really quite striking. The reasons they emigrated, I think we've got to look at many reasons. That's why I call them a bit of a domino effect. I mean, the main reason, the trigger, the first domino, if you like, is the current crisis. The currents are the dried grapes that were the main export. And there's a crisis in Peloponnesos, in the current cultivating areas, and people leave to address their economic issues. And other people from other regions of Greece and islands see the opportunities, see the fact that people are emigrating, and they follow. So it's the current producing areas of Peloponnesos and southern Greece, but then it spreads to the rest of the Greek-speaking areas. And then, part of the dominoes is that, you've got shipping agents and ships that actually promote this. They put advertisements in newspapers telling you how easy it is to get to the United States. And therefore that encourages the migration as well. But really the main issue is the first domino, as I said, are the Corinthian currents. And there's an extraordinary little story here, because the French grape production gets affected by a blight, phylloxera, in the 1880s, which means the French are not exporting, and therefore the Greeks are the second biggest exporter. And this is the time when currants are very popular in Britain, because they are a staple for these British desserts. As you can see here, I've got this photograph of what is called a traditional spotted dick, quintessential British dessert, which relies on currants. So Greece is 60% of Greek exports by the 1880s and 1890s are currants, because there is such high demand in Britain. Then the French vines recover by the 1890s. They take over the exports, leaving the Greeks in the lurch. And all those Greeks who had focused on vine production and cultivation are now unable to export, so they emigrate. But the reason that they will emigrate to the United States is not just economic, but social, because what is happening, part of the economic crisis in Peloponnesos has to do with the fact that families with daughters are still holding out for, families with daughters still have to produce dowries for their daughters to be married, because families with sons, now that they haven't got any other economic means, are holding out for the type of dowries that existed during the good old days of the current exports of the 1880s and 1890s. As we know, the family is the main unit for the Greeks. So the families with daughters make this decision to send the oldest boy, the oldest son, over to the United States to bring back money for the family, so that the daughter can have the proper type of wedding with a proper type of dowry. This is a beautiful photograph. This is not from Peloponnesos. It's from Karpathos, the island of Olympos, but it just shows us the significance of dowries. So in a sense, migration was related to economics, but also family needs. And, the early migrants are all men. So everyone says, oh, it's just men going over to make money. No, it's sons of families going over to make money for their families, because we're talking about Greece, where the family is so important. And they send back the remittances, they get their sisters married, and there's also evidence of of an improvement in the area. There's no usurious lending rates anymore. People don't have to gauge in high interest to borrow money. Living standards are raised, and new houses are built. And those new houses, of course, because that's money from America, are called the Americanica houses.
Very interesting.
I've got a couple more slides about the integration of the immigrants and identity, but I don't know if we want to talk about other things now.
No, you can show those if you want. We will ask you more questions later, but go ahead, you can show them.
Okay. Good.
We're pretty loose here.
That's great. You know, when the Greeks arrive in the United States, there are two competing visions of America. There's America as a melting pot, and Israel Zangwill is a playwright in 1911, 1912. He's part of the people who think that America should be welcoming immigrants. But there is another vision of America, which is hostile, xenophobic towards the immigrants of Southeastern Europe. And there's the Greeks face a lot of xenophobia and racism, and there's many of these announcements in newspapers. No Greeks need apply because they are not considered to be the right type of people that the older Americans want to employ. So this is a period that begins in around 1910 onwards and goes through the 1920s. And the Greek response to this is to adapt. If anything, the Greek migrant, the Greek member of the diaspora, if anything, is adaptable to the circumstances. So there is spontaneous responses and organized responses. On the left, this is a picture of Aristodimos Kaldis, who is one of the best known Greek-American artists of the 20th century. And I was interviewing his son actually just a few days ago, and he gave me a beautiful story. He said that Aristodimos arrived in 1917, settled in Newport, Rhode Island, and one of the first things that the Greeks there did was to learn Irish songs. And I said, yes, what? And the thing is, they went out to the bars late and emerged from them in an inebriated state. And the Rhode Island and the Northeast was policed by Irish policemen. So as soon as they saw an Irish policeman, these inebriated Greek immigrants broke out into wonderfully rendered Irish songs and stayed safe. It's a story.
It's a great story.
It's a great story, but it speaks to the adaptability of the Greeks. I mean, they learned the Irish songs so well. The other, of course, big story is AHEPA. I think everyone who's following this conference knows about AHEPA, established in 1922 to organize the Americanization and the adoption of American citizenship and the adoption of the English language by Greek immigrants. Hugely successful, hugely effective. This is one of the many articles that appear in the 1920s. Its members, including leading Greek residents of this section, are pledged to become better citizens through education and general enlightenment. The Greeks have chosen this as their land of adoption, etc. AHEPA is very, very effective in actually protecting not only its members, but Greeks and Greek immigrants. And on the left, you see here that the year after AHEPA was established, there were 2,920 Greeks who acquired US citizenship. And by 1927, they were 9,518. And this is all AHEPA pushing the Greeks to take citizenship. And during, until the eve of World War II, you've got almost 65,000 Greeks adopting citizenship. My other slide is just a reminder to everyone. We talk about AHEPA as a force of assimilation and integration, but it did also foster ties with Greece. And this is the front page of the Vradini newspaper of Athens. This is the first of the annual excursions AHEPA does to Greece. And it's front page news for all the newspapers. They're welcomed by the government. There's a lot of events in Athens. And then there are several days left for the members of AHEPA. And of course, what do? They go back to their villages in Peloponnesos and elsewhere. And this is an example of how AHEPA and how Greeks, I think, both integrate, adapt, but also maintain the ties to the homeland. And my final couple of 2-3 slides have to do with what I just said, the way that they adapt on the one hand, but they preserve their national identity. And I think when we talk about Greek identity, I think it's really language, religion, and place of origin. That's why I'm a great admirer of everyone involved in this Ancestry project, because I think place of origin, historically, I see as very important element of Greek identity. But it's really the church which is the main agency of Greek identity in the United States. And that happens because in 1931, newly appointed Archbishop Athinagoras, who will eventually become ecumenical patriarch, calls for the local parishes to replace the local Greek community organizations. Earlier, the community organization ran the church. Athinagoras comes along and says there's too much politics, there's too much Venizelist royalists, there's too much personal stuff. We don't want the parish beholden to the community. We want the parish to be the main body locally in American towns, and administer the schools, administer the philanthropic organizations through the Ladies Philoptochos, etc. So the church, in a sense, with Athinagoras, takes over the responsibility of fostering Greek identity. So Greek identity is very much tied up with religion because of the hugely important role that the church plays. I think Greek Orthodox churches also foster, I'm concluding here, foster a third element of identity, attachment to the place of origin. The slide on the left is from St. Sophia in Los Angeles, which is one of the most impressive Greek Orthodox churches in America. But I think the building of Greek Orthodox churches, especially those who have Byzantine style architecture, but whatever the outside architecture, the inside of a Greek church in America, I think, and the liturgy reminds Greek immigrants of home, of place, of village, of the church locally. And I think it's a very, very important connection that they have. I think they come into the church and they somehow have a sense that a connection with Greece. Of course, the other big organizations that foster local identity are the ubiquitous topika somatia, as they're called, local societies. I've got a couple of slides here. The Pontian Society, established in 1939 in Philadelphia, and the Kassos, the small island of Kassos, has its own society founded in 1929 in the Bronx. I'm always asked about the future. My mentor, Professor Briones, always used to say, when they asked him, "You're asking the wrong person. I'm a historian. I know about the past, not the future." So with that proviso, if I were to ask about the future of Greek identity, I think language will inevitably erode, but I think religion and a sense of heritage, which includes genealogy, will stay very, very strong and robust. And I think Greek identity will survive thanks to those elements.
Well, we do see a huge increase in people that are interested in their Greek heritage. And I think that has to do with what generation we're in. My immigrant were my grandparents. So that was the early 1900s. So now we don't have them anymore. We don't have any reference to it. So we're all reaching out to try to identify with that. Okay, Ganda.
Thank you.
When I'm fascinated by this subject, okay, but when did children from Greece start being adopted by families in America, and why did the families put these children up for adoption? And how many children were adopted in that period?
Thank you. I'm hoping to answer all these questions, the when, the what, the why, and the how, equally important. But I'd first like to say a big thank you that this topic of the adoptions can be part of a Greek ancestry conference. And a special thank you to you, Georgia, because you know that the questions of the Greek adoptees have been coming fast and furiously to the Hellenic genealogy geek. So there is some sort of a movement brewing. And if I may build on Gregory's wonderful presentation and Alexander, Gregory who qualified an early migration, Alexander who qualified a mass migration, I may actually characterize this one as a silenced migration, a silent migration, occasionally even silenced migration, but no longer silent because these people are speaking for themselves and issuing their own books as adoptees. And I'm showing just two that came out in 2019. This one, Beyond the Third Door by an American adoptee. This one, The Foundling of Crete by a Greek adoptee who grew up in the Netherlands, 400 pages in Dutch. So clearly people have a lot to say about this. And I welcome this movement because I'm only the researcher who would love to take backstage if it wasn't clearly that this topic required some attention. And let me now turn to my fact sheet so I can walk through the questions that Georgia put out for us. And here goes. I hope you can all see it.
Yes, we can.
Yeah. So a few facts then. When? Well, this adoption movement from Greece to the US should be situated between 1948 and all through the 1960s. And from Greece to the US, we see more than 3,000 children travel. And that is a conservative estimate. There are more. And then in addition to those several thousands of children going to the US, there are another 600 Greek children who go to the Netherlands. And they're probably the most forgotten of all, also because they operate in their own language, which is Dutch, and don't immediately tap into the Greek American movement concerning these adoptions. Now, these children go to the US, and I'm going to focus mainly on the US, in waves. And it's important to kind of distinguish various waves. In a first wave, they are war orphans, orphana polemu, right? And of course, very many are born during the Civil War, have lost parents during the Civil War, or cannot be absorbed by exhausted families of the early 50s. And sure enough, through some sort of an Greek-American, AHEPA-led charitable movement, these war orphans find homes and adoptions in the US, very often with distant family members. So very often these people then are indeed orphans, have memories of the war, have nowhere to go to in Greece, and are absorbed into Greek American families, but with full knowledge of their roots. They know exactly what happened to them. Many of them are already teenagers. That movement shifts very, very quickly. By the mid-50s, we're looking at a totally different adoption movement. And by now, by 1955, we see a lot of illegitimate children go from Greece to the US. These are the children born to typically very young mothers who are not married. And given that there is limited access to abortion, a tremendous sense of shame on the and not exactly an economic opportunity for single mothers to make a life on their own with their child. These children end up in orphanages, but orphanages for very young children, which in Greek we call vrephokomia. Very often they are foundlings. Very often they are anonymously delivered to the vrephokomia. And here is where it gets problematic for these people's ancestry search, because they are, and they drop from the moon, as it were. They come without any identifying markers, without any paperwork, very often without a fixed date of birth. So the illegitimate babies then form the main component of the second wave of this adoption movement from Greece to the US, which in the US is facilitated by the 1953 Refugee Relief Act, which as an act doesn't exactly respond to Greece. It responds rather to the Americans' desire to do something for orphans all over the world. But dare I say, and we have to speak clear language here, the American preference is for white orphans. And they're still called orphans, even though most of them are not. But you can see how something of that previous language of the war orphans still sticks to these children, which I would much rather prefer to call adoptees. So these institutions then become main sourcing grounds, if I may call them, to send babies, because by now the children are younger, babies on their way to the US. And one of the main leading institutions is the vrephokomia of Patras. In second order comes the vrephokomia of Athens, a little bit from the Aiostylianos foundling home in Thessaloniki, and then later in the 50s also from the Kendro Vrefon, the baby center of Mitera. So you can see that there are various sourcing grounds here that keep a constant stream of adoptees going to the US. Occasionally, but far less often, we see that the contact is directly made between a lawyer and a family interested in adopting and, let's say, a widowed mother. That happens far less. And those circumstances are particularly tragic because you immediately realize that no widowed mother would want to give up a child if it wasn't that she was in dire need. So we move then from older children who had roots and have memories and are therefore meeting less difficulties when searching, to babies, often foundlings. And then we need to remind ourselves of the American laws that organize this all and that allow Americans to adopt up to 2 children at the same time, and sometimes even up to 3 or 4, if they are willing to keep a sibling group together. That would be the criteria, which in itself is, of course, a good thing, so that not everything is uprooting, that there is at least the sibling togetherness. Now, the question then is, who are the intermediaries? The AHEPA is in the lead, especially in the beginning, with that movement of the war orphans. And then by the mid-50s, unfortunately, the AHEPA is again in the lead in this movement kind of souring, and I have to say it, becoming quite lucrative for a few of the AHEPA presidents, in particular Skopas, who then becomes the first subject of a big scandal of 1959. So it's particularly tragic in a way that something that started out with the best intentions deteriorates so quickly, and that the AHEPA is then seen to compete with other institutions and agencies such as the International Social Service, PICPA, which is the Greek Welfare Service, and other private lawyers. So by the mid-50s, instead of trying to place orphans in good homes, we see these various intermediaries compete for children, which are now in shorter supply, compete for children to make sure that families in America get a child. So now the dynamics have very quickly shifted from the demand, the American demand outstripping the supply. And I put this in rather crude, dare I say, economic terms, but that's ultimately what it amounted to. And Greece is identified, sadly so, as the supply of young white children. A supply that occasionally is, dare I say, oversupplied by cutting a few corners. So here is in the late 50s where irregularities come in. And these scandals then of 1959 in New York and in 1962 in Thessaloniki cannot surprise us, obviously. It's also the scandals and the legal action that eventually put a stop to this mass stream of adoptions to America and actually kind of diverted the stream to the Netherlands and then eventually made adoption in Greece focus much more on domestic adoption, children staying in Greece. So then it is indeed somewhat painful that it was very easy for Americans to adopt a child. Financial criteria is what make the cut. People put in their application, they are not very heavily screened. As long as they can prove that they meet the financial criteria, that is unfortunately good enough. You can kind of see that I'm very much aware of the fact that adoption is not a fairy tale story for a whole lot of people. There's a lot of unmet expectations and a lot of unpreparedness and a lot of trauma actually involved. And I'm very
On both sides.
On all sides. And I don't want to cast blame on the prospective parents who weren't very prepared, or on the agencies who were trying to do the right thing. I do want to cast some blame on people who were acting as intermediaries for whom making money was more important than screening the parents carefully. All right, then. What is sad is that there is very poor record keeping attached to these adoptions. So that means that the adoptees to this day have quite a set of hurdles ahead of them to penetrate the various institutions, by the various laws, the various documents, and kind of distill what that all means. And a little bit of Greek government help would be wonderful here, because to this day, we've never seen a full-blown Greek investigation or a full-blown register of these adoptions, and we have a lot more of awareness raising to do as well.
Well, can I ask a question here? I hear, on Hellenic Genealogy Geek, that some people will report that their parents didn't actually give them up, but the parent was told that the child died and that the person was sent and that the child was sent overseas. Did that happen quite often?
It happened, but not as often as we occasionally claim. I want to emphasize that irregularities happened, but they're not the majority of cases. And I hasten to say that because very often this history has been cast in, stolen children and, boatloads full of children. And that is not the case. When we drill down to it, we very often find a mother agreeing to the adoption. But I want to then ask the question, did she have any alternative? And very often there is a lot of family pressure, because an illegitimate child, as strongly knit as the Greek family is and remained, there is really not much room for the illegitimate child. So very often, a lot of family pressure and economic pressure comes to bear on young mothers who are told that this is the best option for their child. So the large majority of cases are indeed of children who were legally relinquished, and there is a court document to go with that, but it's very difficult for us to kind of unpeel the levels of coercion or despair that went into this.
Okay, well, we're going to come back to you. Let's go back to the migration question a second. Gregory, what role did the church play in the early years of Greek migration in the US and other countries? There was no Greek church involved in that, was there?
So religion mattered a lot to those early immigrants. And my opinion is that it was equally or sometimes even more important than national identity. And this is what I call religio-national symbiosis. In mid-19th century, national identities were a relatively new thing, fresh thing. They were still being constructed and spread, while religious identity, on the other hand, and the church had a tradition of millennia. Before nationalism came in the 18th and 19th century, religion was people's primary identification. In the Ottoman Empire, all Orthodox Christians, the Rooms, belonged to one single religious community, regardless of their ethnicity. There were Orthodox people who spoke Greek, Bulgarian, Albanian, Turkish, Arabic, and they all belonged to the same community. They had common churches, and the head of all was the Ecumenical Patriarch in Constantinople. Those people who left in the 1840s and the 1850s, 60s, not only from the Greek kingdom, but also from predominantly Orthodox areas of the Ottoman Empire, such as Chios, brought this understanding with them in the lands of their immigration. This becomes very clear in the case of New Orleans, the home of the oldest Greek Orthodox Church on American soil. In New Orleans, Greeks worked together with Slavs for the foundation of a church, Holy Trinity. This was not because of their small number or a lack of funds. Greeks outnumbered Orthodox Slavs and had sufficient resources to found a church of their own. Cooperation should be, I believe, attributed to the special understanding of belonging to a religious community which transcends national and ethnic lines. The perspective of diplomats or national state-controlled churches was really different. They saw a nationalist dimension in any multi-ethnic cooperation. Their fear was that the other party, be it the Greeks or the Slavs, would take over this or that community. However, sources indicate that ordinary people did not share such concerns. What mattered to them was to have an Orthodox church, to baptize their children, to commemorate their dead. Their religious community did not see nationalist distinctions. For this reason, Holy Trinity Church in New Orleans is decorated with Greek and Russian icons. It has Gospels in Greek and Slavic, and it has a long tradition of a multi-ethnic mass, which also includes Arabs. Actually, according to Holy Trinity's old sacramental journals, which have been preserved, digitized, and recently indexed, from 1891 to 1896, about 40% of the baptized children were Greek, 36% were Arab, and 24% were of Slavic origin. Those immigrants' bond was their faith. Their faith was so strong that they managed to found a church in the New World, something that had previously failed in New York, for example. They managed to find priests, even if complex arrangements had to be made overseas, and the priests had to travel from Syros, Athens, Constantinople. People who did not live in New Orleans, but lived in Mississippi, in Alabama, in St. Louis, or even in New York, they would travel to New Orleans with their children to baptize them.
Wow.
Or alternately, the Holy Trinity priests would travel to distant places such as Chicago to conduct baptisms and marriages. But this is a religio-national symbiosis. So none of these suggests that religion and the church was those people's only identification and interest. The same people formed relief committees when revolution broke out in Crete in 1866. For example, Konstantinos Kililis, who was one of the founders of the Holy Trinity Church in New Orleans, in 1867, he was already gone from Greece for a whole 30 years. but still he did not forget, quote, his sublime duty towards the homeland, and he donated 500 drachmas to the Committee for the Cretan People and another 500 to the Committee for the Formation of a National Fleet. And the same people were trying to convince their American friends to support Greek causes. Some of them were subscribers to newspapers in Greece, and others borrowed Greek newspapers to read if they couldn't afford it. So we are talking really about a balance between religious and national identity, which we do not really see later, and which has been, I think, misunderstood so far.
Okay, that's interesting. Alexander, I find this next question to be very interesting because I've experienced a little bit of it in history. I've seen it. When you had new immigrants coming into the country, but there were older immigrants here already, what was their attitude about the new immigrants?
Okay, so as we know, Gregory spoke about the 19th, and I spoke about the
Right.
And then there is a third wave, aside from that, the wave that Honda put so delicately. There is the people who come in as displaced persons in the 1950s, and then 1965, the immigration laws open up again, and we have about 75,000 Greeks who come from the mid-60s through 1974, and this is Astoria, for instance. And there are big differences. There are big differences. Nikon Patrinakos, one of the Greek Orthodox theologians at the time, has written about how the Greek Greeks thought that the older immigrants were Amerikanakia in a sense. Ironically, of course, now their children
are also, yes,
the same thing. But then there was a difficult symbiosis, and the Greeks from Greece went to the local fraternities, the Topika Somatia. They did not go to AHEPA, who they thought was completely Americanized and a waste of time. And they went and organized their own Greek clubs. And this was the reason why there was this awful clash in 1970 when Archbishop Iakovos said that priests could, it was up to the judgment of the local priest whether the liturgy would take place in English or not, depending on the knowledge of the congregation. And there was a big backlash against Archbishop Iakovos, and this was the new Greeks who had the Greek language newspapers and clubs in the 1970s in New York City. So it took a while. I think there's always that difference.
Well, you know, I grew up, I was born in 1950. I'm giving away my age here, but when this wave of immigrants came in the 60s, okay, my parents were born in the US. It was my grandparents that had come here, but still considered themselves very Greek. They were Greek. When these new immigrants came in, they were like too Greek. Okay, they you know, and there was this clash. They didn't fit in. These two groups did not fit together at all. It wasn't what the people from Greece thought. It was what the ones that were here in the US thought. They were like, wait a minute, you're like too Greek. We don't, you know, they didn't fit into the way they were used to living.
Yes, both sides.
Yes.
It took a while.
Yeah, it sure did. And like you said, as time went on, their children became the Greeks that were Americanized. And, you know, it's very interesting to see. That happens in every nationality, though, I'm sure.
I think what we have in the 1970s, which brings the two Greeks, the two generations together, is the revival of ethnicity, the legitimization of ethnicity, of heritage. This is when Nicholas Gage writes in the New York Times, "It is chic to be Greek." He writes that in 1975. and somehow the older generation, who were so busy assimilating and integrating, suddenly realize, hey, it's okay to be, it's chic to be Greek, and they become more reconciled with their Greek identity, and that, I think, brings them closer to the, let me call them the Astoria Greeks.
Well, it's interesting because my nieces and nephews who are now in their 20s and 30s, they're very proud to be Greek. They
Yes.
are so into being Greek, you know, where when we grew up, we weren't. We were, you know, I never had a Greek in my school, you know, so. All right, let's, I want to ask Ganda about, were Greek adoptees embraced by the Greek communities in the US? How were they adopted by mostly Greek parents, or were they adopted by other ethnic groups? And were they embraced by the Greek community here?
I'm going to start with your second question first. Were they adopted by Greek Americans? That's the minority of cases. The large majority is everything else. And when I say everything else, I mean everything else. So any Greek, any American citizen, and you have to be only one American citizen in a couple, any American citizen who was married, perhaps to another citizen, perhaps not, could apply for a Greek child. So that means that the majority of Greek children end up in any conceivable American family. They have two characteristics, and the characteristics are not ethnicity or Greek ancestry. The characteristics are a certain amount of financial resources to make this possible, and white. This is still very much America of the 1950s, where white couples get priority in adopting white children, which is also one of the reasons why Greek children were so in demand, because they're white and the adoptions are fairly easy. Now, the children that ended up with, let's say, Baptists, Americans in the South, I'm thinking of Texas, where a lot of them went to, don't necessarily have contact with any Greek community, or don't have a good definition of what Greek ancestry is. Their closest contact is their annual attendance at the Greek festival. That's the extent of it, and the occasional Americanized Greek food. On the contrary, then, the children that grew up with Greek Americans, perhaps in clusters in Chicago, had contact with the Greek community, were accepted by the Greek community, welcomed by the Greek community, have an extended network of homogenia, churches, summer camps, festivals that they organize and volunteer in. So it very much depended on the family that took you in. And that is then also the defining factor of whether you kept up the language, the religion, the travel to Greece, the curiosity about Greece, all of it. It comes as a package. But for the large majority of adoptees, the Greek connection has been lost for 50 years and is actually only being rediscovered now, because it's in the 60s, in people's 60s and approaching 70 years old that they're asking questions. It took a COVID lockdown for people to have a little more time on their hands and massively turn to genealogy. It took the voices of a few adoptees to kind of spur the others into searching. And so the questions that have always kind of been on the back burner are now coming out in full force. Now that also more online tools are available and more interlocutors, but also now that the big medical questions are coming up in your 60s, right? Especially in an era when we're all reminded of our vulnerability. A lot of our vulnerability, biological vulnerability, is genetically defined. So that question that was always, where do I come from, and have really nothing to go on, becomes now a question of, let me see what I have. Can I read something about that? Can I talk to people? Can I post my quest on the Hellenic Genealogy Geek? And before you know it, this movement has just really kind of gone in a whirlwind.
Yes, I think when they see other people have success in finding their birth parents, they realize it can be done if those parents are still alive. I think a lot of them too, I might be wrong, this is happening at this age because their adoptive parents have passed away and they don't have to worry about that anymore.
Exactly.
And they can look now with, a clear conscience that they can try to find what's going on.
Yeah, it's a little sad when some would see a certain kind of, that searching would somehow interfere with the loyalty to adoptive parents. But searching is an answer to where do I come from and what does
Right.
that background entail. It has nothing to do with loyalty to adoptive parents, but that's not necessarily how people perceive it. But definitely the fact that they're entering their 60s in an era of crisis and vulnerability has really shaken something loose. And along with the question of searching for their ancestry comes the hope, the ideal, the idealization of recovering Greek citizenship. And do we have a lot to say about that? And include. So here is what I want to do to the people who actually have a say in this matter at Greek consulates. I want to emphasize that this Greek adoptee movement is now 70 years old. They are the oldest mass post-war adoption movement from one country to another. It's also the least known. It's very unknown in Greece, and it needs to be, what is done, but a certain form of redress can still take place. These children traveled with a Greek passport, with a degree very often from the court in Athens, if not Thessaloniki or Iraklio. And these people now, the burden is on them to prove that they're somehow Greek, which is incredibly hard to do if you are a foundling. But they were Greek enough to be sent on their way in the 1950s. These people should be first in line with their requests for Greek citizenship. And ideally, it shouldn't be everybody's fight individually. Ideally, it would be a very nice gesture of any Greek government that wants to take it on, to just hold out an open hand to these people who are so eager to come back, restore them to dual citizenship if that's what they want. It wasn't through any fault of their own that they were set on the plane, let alone lost their citizenship. So if Greece could extend a hand to these people and massively facilitate their access, I'm going to go on access to records and citizenship. That would be a dream come true, and it would do a lot for that unsilencing of the silent migration. On that note, I stop there, but not without expressing my help to make that happen.
Okay. And we are going to stop here for today.
Yeah, well said, Rhonda. So,
thank you. I know I have you on board because you're writing the history of the AHEPA, and something will trickle through there. I've been on your case about that.
Oh, can't wait to read that book. Okay. All right. We'd like to encourage all of our viewers to subscribe to the Greek Ancestry YouTube channel and follow Greek Ancestry on Instagram. And you can get handouts. All the handouts that we have are available on the website, on the conference tab on greekancestry.net. So don't forget that those are there. Now, please join us tomorrow. We have a lot going on tomorrow. And it's basically in 3 different sections: Greeks on and across the border, new research methodologies, and Greek genealogy. What's next? It'll be a very exciting and busy day. So please join us. And thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Alexander and Gregory, for being on this panel today. It was very interesting. Thank you very much. We didn't go too much over, so Gregory won't yell at me. Okay.
Thank you for making this possible. I really appreciate it.
It was nice meeting you both. Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
bye.